Welcome to our Situation Room New Year's Eve special, where we're going to navigate the complex currents of global conflicts as we transition into a brand new year. Today, we're dissecting key theatres of power and struggle that are reshaping our world. First, the journey begins in the turbulent waters of the Black Sea. Here, Ukraine's overshadowed yet crucial counteroffensive against Russian dominance unveils a new era in naval warfare, a story of resilience and strategic shifts. Next, we're going to delve into the enigmatic landscape of Guinea-Bissau, a nation where the lines between coup attempts and political power plays blur, revealing a deep-seated struggle for control amidst political chaos. Moving on to Colombia, we're going to examine the ambitious Total Peace Plan, a bold initiative by President Petro seeking to end decades of violence. We explore its potential triumphs and the challenges it faces in a nation weary of conflict. Then we're going to unravel the aftermath of Wagner Group's mutiny in Russia. Once a formidable force, we investigate its fragmentation and the shifting dynamics within a Russian private military power. And finally, today we've got a global roundup for you, examining the evolving landscapes of international conflicts, from Russia's diminishing influence to China's faltering global strategies and the United States' changing role on the world stage. We're also going to cast light on ongoing wars and emerging hotspots, setting the tone for the geopolitical challenges of 2024. So stay with us as we provide insight and analysis on these critical stories, understanding their implications for the future. This is the Situation Room, your guide to the complex tapestry of global conflict as we step into a new year. As wars go, it's far from overlooked. Even as the conflict in Gaza has come to dominate headlines, the Ukraine war still remains one of the biggest, best-known military confrontations on the planet. A sprawling conflict with front lines stretching over 1,200 kilometers and a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Yet even within such a closely followed war, important actions can still go unnoticed, drowned out by a rush of information, which is why, for this section, we've decided to focus on one frequently overlooked part. Perhaps the single shining ray of hope in what has otherwise been a disappointing 2023 for Ukraine, the Black Sea Theatre. If you could go back to early 2022 and ask almost any expert who would win the confrontation in the Black Sea, the answer would be, yeah, definitely Russia. At the outset of the full-scale invasion, Moscow dominated the waves. Although Ukraine had inherited parts of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet after the collapse of the USSR, the majority of Kyiv's ships had already been captured during the 2014 annexation of Crimea. When the current conflict exploded in February 2022, Ukraine's few remaining vessels were quickly sunk or scuttled. By rights, we should now be living in a world where Moscow has total dominance over the Black Sea. Miraculously, though, we're somehow not. Instead, 2023 saw a remarkable shift in the balance of naval power, one which forced Russia's fleet to retreat from the sea's northwest and abandon their port of Sevastopol in Crimea. As the Telegraph noted, for Ukraine, it is possible to point to this as a fairly major success story in an otherwise attritional conflict. Now, before we dig into this underreported aspect, though, we should make it clear that this doesn't negate the failure of the broader Ukrainian counteroffensive. Too many online takes like to gloss over Kyiv's disappointing performance on land by pointing to victories in the Black Sea. But while everything we're about to cover is indeed impressive, we need to remember that this is mostly a land war, one that won't be decided by what happens at sea. Or as the New York Times phrased it, this year's Black Sea counteroffensives were a critical victory, but they changed little in the overall course of the war and did not allow Ukraine to retake any territory. Still, that's not to say that it hasn't been a nightmare for Moscow. By forcing Russia's fleet to relocate to Novorossiysk away from Crimea and southern Ukraine, Kyiv has badly disrupted naval logistics for the Kremlin. This also piled on the costs, with Moscow now having to invest precious resources in layered defenses against future attacks. More importantly, the retreat of the Russian naval threat has allowed Ukraine to unilaterally open a shipping corridor, allowing the transport of grain and supplies to the outside world. So far, around 200 ships have carried some 7 million tons of cargo through that corridor. As senior American officials anonymously told The Times, this represents a major naval victory by a country without a navy. So, now seems like a good time to dig into a little bit about how Kyiv actually managed this. Now, the first thing to note is that this localized victory didn't come out of the blue, but was the result of Ukraine building on advances made since the opening days of the war. This was the era when an amphibious Russian landing at Odessa was expected imminently, when the Black Sea Fleet seemed tasked with cutting off the southern coast, destroying Ukraine's ability to exist as an economically viable nation. Hence Moscow's prohibition on navigation in the Black Sea's northwest. As the covert Shores blog recounts, they followed this up up with attacks on third country merchant vessels, ensuring a total blockade of Ukraine's ports. It's a blockade that would doubtless still be in effect today had it not been for three notable Ukrainian victories. The first was the successful effort to hold Odessa. On land, that meant the armed forces making a stand at Mykolaiv that halted the Russian advance. At sea, that meant heavy mining of the waters to prevent an amphibious landing. The second victory was more widely reported. On April 14, 2022, two Neptune missiles slammed into the side of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship cruiser Moskva, sending it below the waves, the first Russian flagship lost in combat since 1905. Finally, on June 30th, Ukraine's forces secured the third victory when they managed to push the Russian garrison off of Snake Island. Realizing their ships were becoming vulnerable, the Kremlin dropped its total blockade. Instead, the establishment of a grain corridor was negotiated with the help of the UN and Turkey, a corridor Moscow then tried to use as leverage over the world. And technically, this is where the story takes a pause, one that lasted until Russia withdrew from the grain deal this summer and Ukraine set about trying to forge an alternative corridor. But that doesn't mean the Black Sea theater was completely calm in the meantime. Most significantly, October 2022 saw Kyiv launch its first large-scale attack using sea drones, what experts prefer to call uncrewed surface vessels, or USVs. The attack itself was small potatoes, lightly damaging the Admiral Makarov, yet the implications were enormous. The attack marked the first time a state actor effectively used a USV swarm to disable an enemy vessel. Although the attack was minor, we compared it in a previous video to the moment in 1916 when tanks first appeared on World War I's Western Front. It was the potential start of something much bigger. In the years since, our assessment's been vindicated. One major key to Ukrainian successes in 2023's naval war has been the appearance of USVs like the Magura V5, which can carry explosives up to 370 kilometers, far enough to cover nearly 2/3 of the Black Sea. Since Moscow pulled out of the grain deal, Magura V5s have been used to damage the Kerch Strait Bridge linking occupied Crimea to Russia. They've also been used to sink Russian vessels, including two on November 10th. Yet it's not only thanks to surface drones that Kyiv was able to force the Black Sea Fleet into retreat. Special forces operations and detonated missiles also played a role. In September, a raid by Ukrainian commandos managed to take out S-400 air defenses in Crimea, allowing subsequent strikes on the peninsula with Storm Shadow missiles. One strike hit the Sevastopol headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, possibly killing over 30. Another took out an expensive Kilo-class submarine while it was in dry dock. In November, Caliber cruise missile-firing corvette the Arskold was likewise hit while still in its shipyard. It was this combination of donated foreign weapons and locally produced USVs, combined with daring commando operations, that ultimately pushed the Russian fleet out of occupied Ukraine. That likely led to Moscow announcing it would build a new naval base in the breakaway Georgia region of Abkhazia. That ultimately allowed Ukraine to open its own unilateral shipping corridor. As the Telegraph explains, the net result of the pushing back of the Black Sea Fleet to the east is that the water between the Ukrainian port of Odessa and Snake Island is now fairly safe for merchant shipping. This is important because once a ship passes Snake Island, it enters the territorial waters of Romania, a NATO member. And for all of his bluster, Putin is not yet ready to start openly attacking vessels in NATO waters. Now, this doesn't mean shipping companies are completely safe working with Ukraine. On November the 9th, a Russian missile hit a Liberian-flagged vessel near Odessa, killing one. Nor does it mean Ukraine isn't still economically suffering from Moscow's attempted blockade. Exports from Odessa region are barely half of what they were pre-war. But it does mean that Kyiv has been thrown an economic lifeline, one boosted by an international consortium working to provide affordable insurance for companies that use the shipping corridor. Like we said earlier, this makes it a ray of hope amid what's otherwise been a gloomy year for Kyiv, a ray of hope that got surprisingly little coverage from a media focused on the counteroffensive. Yet, we didn't want to highlight this particular story just to give Ukraine supporters a much-needed shot of Christmas cheer. While welcome, the victories here are unlikely to alter the overall course of the war. No. We wanted to use this story to shine a spotlight on a bigger issue, the way developments in the Black Sea are likely to herald a new era of naval warfare. Ukraine, remember, is a country without a navy, one that has gone up against a major maritime power and managed to secure a meaningful victory. Of course, Kyiv has been helped in this by Turkey's decision to close the Bosphorus to warships, meaning Moscow can't bring its full naval might to bear. Still, as Defense News writes, Ukraine has shown that a combination of USVs, land-based missiles, and naval mines can deny a superior navy the ability to exercise sea control, at least in a relatively confined body of water. And that is a massive deal, because it may point to a future in which other maritime powers can be challenged by a far weaker opponent. Right now, Magura V5s are reported to cost about $250,000 a unit, a large amount of money to one day found in your bank account, but barely a fraction of a rounding error in your average defense budget. And it is orders of magnitude cheaper than what a ship would cost. If we're heading into a world in which swarms of cheap USVs can disable multi-billion-dollar warships, then the whole balance of global naval power is going to come into question. Already, some, such as American magazine Responsible Statecraft, are calling for a serious rethink in US naval spending. Now, we've not reached this brave new world yet. But like those World War I commanders who saw the first tanks in action in 1916 and grasped the era that lay ahead, we may be able to already see such a world on the horizon. The longer the Ukraine war goes on, the more advances are going to come. Russia is now mass developing its own USV. Kyiv is working on a subsurface version. It could be that 20 years from now, the Black Sea Theatre in 2023 isn't remembered for the impact it had on the current conflict, but for how it prefigured the conflict still to come. Naval wars in which a much smaller opponent can deal a devastating blow to a recognized maritime power. And with that, next up, we're going to travel to one of Africa's smallest nations to touch on a story that we missed in our regular weekly roundups. A tale of a coup that maybe wasn't actually a coup, or was perhaps even carried out by its supposed victim. It's confusing. Now, the place is Guinea-Bissau, a tiny West African state of 1.6 million that's broadly known for two things. One of those things is poverty, with about 70% of the population living on less than $2 a day. And two, being such a hub for drug traffickers that the UN once called it Africa's first narco state. Congratulations? Yet there's a third thing it should probably be known more widely for: endless political chaos. It's into this latter category that the events of November the 30th and December the 1st this year fell. Overnight, residents of the capital were woken by the sounds of pitched gun battles. At a central police station, the National Guard were fighting Army Special Forces over custody of two MPs accused of corruption: Finance Minister Suleiman Seydi and Treasury Secretary Antonio Monteiro. Although the National Guard briefly secured the ministers, the army ultimately won the battle. By noon on Friday, National Guard head Colonel Victor Tchongo was in custody. Regional bloc ECOWAS had deployed peacekeepers on the capital streets, and President Umaro Sissoco Obama had returned from COP28 in Dubai to denounce what he called the attempted coup. Leaders of other African nations breathed a sigh of relief. The source of this widespread relief isn't hard to fathom. Since 2020, there have been 9 successful coups, starting with Mali and then running through Sudan, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and Gabon. On top of that, there have been attempted coups in the Gambia and Sao Tome and Principe, while just a week before the gun battle in Bissau, an eerily similar scenario played out in nearby Sierra Leone. In that case, a firefight erupted in the capital of Freetown that ultimately killed 20 people and saw some 2,000 inmates broken out of prison. As in Guinea-Bissau, the putschists were defeated. But the closeness and similarities undoubtedly put people on edge, especially in the context of Guinea-Bissau's troubled history. Yes, when we said that this nation should be known for endless political chaos, the emphasis really was on endless. Since it gained independence from Portugal in 1974, Guinea-Bissau has seen so many coups that people can't even agree on the total number. According to the BBC, some say 9, some say 10. In all that time, only a single democratically elected leader has completed his term in office: President José Maria Vaz, who stepped down in 2019. That same year, President Embalo was elected, although frankly, it's kind of amazing that he's still there. Prior to the events of December, he'd already survived one attempted overthrow. Back in February of 2022, as the world was distracted by Russia's pending invasion of Ukraine, gunmen assaulted the governmental palace during a meeting between the president and the prime minister. For 5 hours, gunshots rang out across the capital. 11 people were killed. When order was finally restored, a shaken President Embalo declared the attack the work of the narco traffickers operating in his country. And it is here that our story starts to get extremely murky. According to a BBC report shortly after the 2022 coup attempt, quote, "Some are now doubting the official version of events. The assault on the government palace was marked by oddities. The army didn't respond for 5 hours. When asked how it survived the attack, the president said God himself had saved him. Regarding the narco trafficker link, no evidence was ever produced." Political analyst Ree Landham told the BBC that, quote, "Mr. Embalo may have staged the coup. The president had recently fallen out with the government, and it appeared his position was weakening. To be clear, this is all speculation. We absolutely are not knowledgeable enough about the inner workings of politics in Guinea-Bissau to say whether or not the 2022 coup was real or not. However, the perception that it may have been faked definitely has had a bearing on the most recent coup attempt, especially when you consider the divisions between president and government that have again cracked wide open. Remember we said that the goal of the National Guard had been to secure custody of the Finance Minister and the Treasury Secretary? Well, in the Guinea-Bissau system, the majority party in parliament appoints government ministers. Since elections in June, that party has been PAIGC, who consider themselves in opposition to President Mbalo. Because they control the Interior Ministry, PAIGC also control the National Guard. Meanwhile, the president controls the prosecutor's office. The reason the National Guard assaulted the police station was because the prosecutor's office had ordered the arrest of the two ministers. In other words, it looks like what unfolded was less a regular coup d'etat and more a power struggle between president and parliament. One played out, not with secret briefings, but with bullets. This becomes increasingly relevant when you hear what happened next. On December the 4th, so about 3 days after the firefight in Bissau, President Mbalo abruptly dissolved parliament, claiming to, quote, "The normal functioning of the institutions of the Republic has become impossible. These facts confirm the existence of a grave political crisis." The problem? No one's sure if he really had the legal right to do that. Although Parliament in the Guinea-Bissau system appoints the government, the president reserves the right to dismiss it under certain circumstances, including during a serious crisis. Now, a coup attempt by the National Guard would definitely count as such a crisis, but no one knows if a putsch is really what happens. We only have Mbalo's word for it. Nor is the case for dismissal so clear-cut. Speaking to Radio France Internationale, one of the Portuguese lawyers who helped draft the Guinea-Bissau constitution, Jorge Miranda, pointed to Article 94, number 1, which states that Parliament cannot be dissolved for 12 months after it is elected under any circumstances. With elections only taking place in the summer of 2023, that would pretty clearly make Mbalo's actions unconstitutional. Indeed, Jorge Miranda even told RFI that the president was the one carrying out the real coup by concentrating all power into his own hands. Again, we're not qualified to say who is right here. To our eternal shame, nobody working on this video has ever taken a class called Guinea-Bissau Constitutionalism 101. We're sorry. What we are qualified to say, though, is that it looks like, coup or no coup, Guinea-Bissau is descending into an unholy mess. On December the 13th, an attempt by the dissolved parliament to meet was broken up with tear gas on the president's orders. Although the PAIGC's party's prime minister, Geraldo Martins, has now been reinstated, it's at the head of a government controlled by Mbalo, one which will need to call for new elections within 90 days or risk another constitutional crisis. So that's where the situation in Guinea-Bissau stands at the time of writing, December the 20th. A great big pile of confusion, in which anywhere between 0 and 2 coup attempts may have taken place, where parliament is in open conflict with the president and where both sides have their own armed forces to call on if they believe it's necessary. It's the sort of foobar mess that my Czech friends would probably describe as a bordel. To be honest, we were initially drawn to this story because of its surface similarities to other coups that rocked Africa this year, such as those in Niger and Gabon. However, in researching this, it's become clear that the chaos in Guinea-Bissau is worth paying attention to for another reason, because it may be laying the groundwork for something far darker to take place in 2024, something with the potential to cause more suffering and chaos than a mere coup. To explain what we mean, we'll give the last word of this section to Jorge Miranda, the Portuguese constitutional lawyer. Speaking to RFI on possible solutions to the crisis, he had only these chilling words to offer. Unfortunately, there is no political solution. It will end up being a military solution. The president used force to impose his will. Sooner or later, force will depose him. And now, let's move on to our next story, Colombia's total peace plan. And in its broad outlines, it's likely one of the most ambitious political processes ever undertaken. In late 2022, Colombia's newly elected president, Gustavo Petro, began working on a plan dubbed Paz Total, or Total Peace, a plan designed to utterly end organized violence in the South American nation. At the time of his election, Colombia had become a place desperate for change. Massive protests against corruption had rocked cities in 2021, and homicides were rising after years of falling. With his vision for total peace, Petro had seemed to represent a break with the nation's old guard. A left-wing populist who promised to disarm the remaining guerrillas and criminal gangs, not with military action, but with programs designed to tackle the root causes of Colombia's violence. This included things like social programs to get disadvantaged youth out of the clutches of gangs and into education. But it also included negotiations with any armed group willing to talk in good faith. And believe me, Colombia has a lot of armed groups. Although the largest of all, Marxist-Leninist rebels FARC, mostly disarmed in 2016 following a separate peace process, Colombia is still thought to have something in the region of 90 criminal outfits comprising left-wing guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, drug cartels, and small-time gangs. Taken all together, the government estimates that their combined membership is at over 31,000 people, enough to put entire cities in a stranglehold. At least 7 of them were in open conflict with the state in 2022. Petro's big idea was to not just talk to the politically motivated groups, as previous governments had done, but to everyone. That meant offering ceasefires and negotiations to huge cartels like the Gaetanista Self-Defense Forces, also known as the Gulf Clan. But it also meant offering talks with much smaller outfits like the Los Shotos and the Los Espetanos gangs in Buenaventura, or Medellin's multiple local mafias. Most eye-catching of all was Petro's unilateral declaration of a ceasefire in December 2022 with 5 armed groups. For 6 months, the government would pause military operations against not just the Gulf Clan, but also 2 FARC offshoots that refused the 2016 peace process, Estado Mayor Central, EMC, and Second Marquetalia. Most controversially of all, it would also pause operations against the largest remaining left-wing rebel group, ELN. Given ELN was the group behind a 2019 suicide bombing in Bogota that killed 21 police officers, offering them a ceasefire, pretty big deal. The sort of act that could be taken as a sincere goodwill gesture, or just as hopelessly naive. Still, the move initially seemed to work. January 2023 was one of Colombia's least violent months on record. It was only later that the picture grew decisively more mixed. Now, as we approach the end of this year, we can look back at the ways total peace has and hasn't changed Colombian society, and we can ask, can the plan still succeed, or is it nothing more than a heroic failure? Before we get onto the data, we need to briefly situate total peace within its proper context, to give you some idea of just how deep-rooted violence has become in parts of the country. Although it has changed in intensity and scope over the decades, Colombia's armed conflict has now been ongoing since 1964. That was the year FARC and ELN were founded with the goal of importing Cuban-style revolution. Yet while 1964 saw the current conflict start, it wasn't the beginning of the violence. A previous war, La Violencia, had run from 1948 to 1958 and killed about 200,000 people. Colombia's Truth Commission has estimated that another 450,000 were killed in left-wing, far-right, and cartel violence between 1958 and 2016. Meanwhile, nearly 7 million were displaced from their homes. This is the environment that Petro inherited, one that had seen huge security gains since the mid-2000s, especially after the peace process with FARC, but one in which armed conflicts, over half a century old, continue to claim lives. Perhaps it's no wonder voters backed his total peace approach. Whether that gamble paid off, well, that's another matter. In October, the Foundation for Peace and Reconciliation released a report showing that kidnappings had surged across the first 10 months of the year, along with a host of lesser crimes. According to the Financial Times, across Colombia, kidnappings have increased more than 80% under Petro, and extortion is up by 27%. This was kidnapping at their highest rates since FARC disarmed in 2016, a surge that was thrust into the international spotlight when ELN abducted the father of football star Luis Diaz in early November. While Diaz's father was released by the rebel group after 12 days, the kidnapping served to highlight 2 important things. 1, the estimated 90 or so kidnapped people still being held by Colombia's various armed groups, and 2, how ongoing illegal actions by these groups could yet derail total peace. In a poll published by Datetsko after Diaz's father was snatched, a mere 37% of Colombians said they wanted the peace process with ELN to continue. 53% said talks should be halted. Nor did the decline only affect talks with ELN. According to Crisis Group, to quote, just 28.5% of Colombians in one recent survey said they believe total peace is working well, while nearly 67% felt that public security had deteriorated. This slide in public confidence is likewise demonstrated in Petro's popularity ratings, from 60% when he assumed office to under 30%, an approval rating that would make Joe Biden look beloved in comparison. To be fair, Colombian presidents usually have underwater ratings, so this isn't that unusual. What is unusual, political consultant Andreas Meyer-Wagner told The Economist, is just how quickly Petro's ratings plummeted. Still, we need to emphasize that the year hasn't been one of total failure. While most gang-related crimes are rising, the homicide rate has declined slightly, and the government has won some significant concessions. Just recently, the FARC offshoot EMC declared it would cease kidnapping people. In December of 2022, gang-related homicides in the city of Buenaventura briefly dropped to 0 as the groups engaged with the government, although killings have since ticked back up again. The last part serves as a handy illustration of both the ongoing promises and disappointments of total peace. For all Petro's good intentions, his administration has often been unable to keep up with the nitty-gritty demands of making peace. To take Buenaventura as our example, there the Los Shotas and Los Espantantes gangs were convinced to engage in a truce that wound up lasting several months. Yet the government couldn't progress the talks beyond that, because unlike with the guerrillas, no legal framework exists for negotiating with regular gangs. As the truce curdled into frustration, homicides began to climb again. Another major instance of dreams outpacing reality was the 6-month ceasefire that opened in 2023. While attacks did decline, there's evidence that ELN, EMC, and the Gulf Clan used the pause in military activity to consolidate their territory, expand their reach, and grow more powerful. The government has since revised its strategy to one of putting military pressure on groups that refuse to negotiate, but the 6-month ceasefire was still a strategic gift to multiple bad actors. Finally, there are legitimate worries about what might come after any peace deal. When FARC disarmed in 2016, the then government agreed to implement 578 agreements designed to tackle the root cause of violence, yet barely half were ever fulfilled. Worse, the authorities failed to establish a proper presence in former FARC areas, allowing smaller groups like ELN to move in and dramatically expand their power. Many worry the same thing could simply happen again. Luckily, there are signs that the government is learning from past mistakes, and this new humility may already be helping. Back in August, FARC offshoot EMC weren't even talking to the government. Since then, a renewed military campaign has brought them scuttling back to the negotiating table. It's these small successes that supporters of total peace are pointing to as we move into 2024. Signs that for all of the harsh disappointments of this year, a glimmer of something like victory may now be on the horizon. For the plan's detractors, though, this whole year has been nothing more than a long, painful lesson in reality. They point out that some groups, such as the Gulf Clan, are no longer even in contact with the government, point out that even if the leadership of other groups agrees to disarm, there's no evidence the rank and file will listen. This is a particular problem with ELN, which is an extremely decentralized structure. Reuters reports government officials quietly suggesting as many as 40% of its 6,000 soldiers could refuse any peace deal. Then there are the problems with Petro himself. A former guerrilla in the long-defunct left-wing nationalist M19 group, Petro has spent the year veering between acting the part of a consensus-building peacemaker and a far-left rabble-rouser, railing at the soft coup he claims is being orchestrated against him. To make matters worse, his son Nicolas is currently under investigation for accepting money from cartels in exchange for including them in his father's total peace plan. Both Nicolas and his father deny the charges. Yet for all its undoubted issues, total peace may still remain Colombia's best hope. Here is a country that, to varying degrees of intensity, has suffered civil conflict for nearly 3/4 of a century. A country that for decades has tried to shake off its reputation for violence, even as true peace remains a frustrating mirage. It could very well be that 2024 brings only more failures. Still, we can't help but hope that the warning signs are unwarranted, that things could yet turn a corner, because Colombia deserves a chance to flourish. It deserves to step out from the shadow of its armed groups and gangs. Whether Petro really is the man to lead Colombians into the sunlight is something we're just going to have to wait and see. And next up today, we're going to pivot to the aftermath of one of 2023's moments of highest geopolitical drama, the launch of a mutiny against Russia's Ministry of Defense by the private military company Wagner, the following failed march on Moscow, and finally the violent and entirely foreseeable death of the mutiny's leaders, oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin and military commander Dmitry Utkin. Wagner's march on Moscow was in itself a major crisis for Vladimir Putin's Russia, raising questions on whether the beleaguered autocrat could survive Moscow's internal power battles during a raging war of aggression in Ukraine. But in the months since the mutiny, with Wagner's former leaders dead and Putin still in power, it begs the question, what happened to the Wagner Group? Where are their commanders now? Does Wagner itself still exist? And what's going to happen to them in the coming years? For a group of Wagner's deadly serious reputation, well known for recruiting violent prisoners and committing all manners of war crimes in Ukraine, Syria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and elsewhere, simply scrubbing them from the face of the earth has never been an option for Moscow. Wagner has long been regarded as Russia's premier private army, responsible for managing operations across the world in places where Russia wants to exert a controlling military influence, but doesn't want uniformed Russian troops doing the often unsavory work that entails. And during Russia's war in Ukraine, Wagner led the Russian military apparatus in recruiting prisoners to fight on the front lines, a highly controversial practice that saw Wagner's ranks swell, with any prisoners lucky and skilled enough to stay alive. Although Wagner and the Russian MOD have had more than their fair share of issues during the war, Wagner has been an indispensable part of the Russian war effort, without which the whole thing might have collapsed under its own weight. In the weeks following the Wagner mutiny, the Russian government took early steps to strip away the bulk of their autonomy as well as their power. Wagner fighters who didn't join the mad dash on Moscow were offered contracts with the Russian military, an offer that saw many among their ranks bring their experience and technical expertise to units that badly needed their support. The group's heavy weapons were largely reappropriated, and most of their personnel inside Russia and Ukraine were sent to Belarus. While in the Ukraine war, Wagner units were pulled from active combat and their duties were handed off. Then, of course, the group's two leaders broke the Russian national record for highest altitude incidents of someone getting mysteriously pushed out of a window, or in this case, getting their entire plane pushed out of existence. But after that, the group has largely left the public consciousness with no real update about where their fighters went. In the moments since the group fell off the radar, large numbers of Wagner fighters have taken the Russian military up on their invitation, largely because of a decision to recruit one Andrei Troshev to the Russian ranks. Troshev is one of a few top Wagner commanders who didn't get himself swept up in the chaos of Prigozhin's mutiny, and he seems to have the respect of both a large portion of the Wagner ranks as well as Putin himself. In late September, Troshev was tasked personally by Putin with overseeing volunteer units in Ukraine, a sign that many analysts around the world took as a signal that Troshev will be the person who ushers Wagner fighters back to Ukraine. Around the same time, Ukraine confirms that hundreds of Wagner fighters had returned to the battlefield after joining up with the Russian MOD, a number that likely climbed much higher once Troshev became an intermediary. Troshev is himself a decorated commander with past experiences as a soldier in Afghanistan and Chechnya, and he's been credited for the storming of Palmyra, which Russia liberated from the Islamic State in 2016. He also appears to have direct connections to Putin, or at least have enough things in common that Putin is likely to regard Troshev as more easily controlled than Prigozhin ever was, thus making him a safe conduit to bring Wagner back in. However, reports from Russian sources have indicated that the Wagner Group hasn't yet fallen apart either. Its new leader is believed to be a man named Anton Yelazarov, code sign Lotus, a former airborne platoon commander who led prominent Wagner attacks in the Ukrainian city of Soledar and the Battle of Bakhmut. Wagner has denied that Yelazarov leads the organization, but as the group's head of combat and training, he's the highest-ranked member of Wagner who's currently known. Most likely, he's overseen the Wagner Group's efforts to train the Belarusian military, a large initiative that's been celebrated loudly by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. According to the Russian war blog Rybar, Wagner fighters are believed to have returned to Ukraine and specifically Bakhmut, although whether they're under the control of Yelazarov or Troshev or both is unknown. But if that wasn't confusing enough, there's also a third faction to consider, a branch of Wagner that splintered off and joined an organization called Rosgvardia, a militarized force that currently serves as Russia's National Guard. The organization is separate from the proper Russian army, but nonetheless recruits fighters and sends them out to Ukraine, making them a good fit for Wagner troops who want to continue to fight but are hesitant to put any trust into the Russian MOD. Wagner's contingent under Rosgvardia has kept its name Wagner and organized itself around Yevgeny Prigozhin's son Pavel, who prior to his father's death had lived mostly in the shadows. Just 25 years old, the younger Prigozhin was granted most of his father's assets upon his death. With that leverage and influence, Pavel appears to have worked out a deal in which his fighters don't have to sign Ministry of Defense contracts and are able to keep the spirit, ideology, and organization of the Wagner Group alive despite its new affiliation. One other thing that they've been able to keep is the Wagner name, which this branch has leaned on in recruitment efforts all across Russia intended to usher in a new wave of fighters. This time, the Rosgvardia's affiliated Wagner contingent seems to be staying away from recruits with criminal records, perhaps to sanitize the image of this particular offshoot in hopes of getting a fresh start. But among other current and former Wagner fighters, the group's organization under Pavel Prigozhin appears to be more of a public relations matter than a military one. Said one Wagner ex-commander speaking with The Guardian, "In all my meetings with Prigozhin, I never saw Pavel present. He was not being groomed for succession." To me, it is clear that the authorities are using Pavel's last name to attract fighters. He does not have the authority to lead anything independent. Wagner forces who've chosen to completely disaffiliate from the group have also been highly sought after by Russia's wide array of other private military companies. Those mercenary groups have seen Wagner's fall from grace as a golden opportunity to better their own fortunes. And with each one looking to be the next top dog, the street cred, veteran experience, and extra manpower that ex-Wagner fighters might provide is just too juicy to pass up. The most successful, at least so far, appears to be a group called Redut, who've long been a B-tier PMC in Russia's back pocket, but they've experienced a resurgence after the fall of Wagner. According to the UK Defence Ministry, Redut has reached out to many ex-Wagner fighters and appears to have had a good deal of success bringing them on board. Other PMCs are believed to be making similar efforts, although this time we've got no insight on any bidding wars happening behind the scenes. Finally, there's one last group of Wagner fighters to consider. There are many hundreds or even thousands of fighters currently stationed across Africa. It's unclear which, if any, of the aforementioned splinter groups these fighters would be loyal to, but their presence in Africa is as important to Moscow as it's ever been. These are the troops loyal to Russia but not affiliated with the government, who protect precious mines, uphold Moscow-friendly regimes, and sow chaos throughout Africa at their leader's command. In the Central African Republic, their work has gone on basically uninterrupted, dominating the country's mining industry and propping up a government that likely would have fallen by now if not for their presence. In Mali, up to 1,000 Wagner fighters have spent months training national forces and directly engaging in counter-terrorism operations against jihadist groups in the Malian desert. There too, they protect several mines and take home an additional check equivalent to over $10 million per month. Their footprint there has only gotten bigger as UN troops have left the wider Sahel region. And in Sudan, they've allied with the rapid support forces in the ongoing war there in exchange for the ability to protect Russian gold merchants and a gold processing plant. Wagner troops have also surfaced recently in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and with Libya, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mozambique and other nations increasingly likely to lean on non-Western support, Wagner is there to fill the void. In reality, it may be that we've got to regard these African Wagner detachments as their own individual entities moving forward, or at the very least as one unified entity that may have very little attachment to Moscow. These African squads have always operated with a high degree of autonomy, and now they're in areas that they know very well, operating with limited direction and no real reason to listen to direction that they disagree with. Each of these groups holds and can thus leverage some very lucrative assets in their respective African nations. They've not been incredibly effective in expanding influence into new hot zones, at least not yet, but it's still early in the post-Prigozhin era, and with nobody from a centralized Wagner hierarchy or from Moscow likely to be able to control them, there's a real possibility that they'll learn how to propagate themselves across the continent basically unchecked. What that means for Africa, with Wagner's brutal reputation and their clear preference for preserving resources at the expense of human life, certainly won't be a good thing. But in some places, Wagner aren't even seen as the bad guys. In the Central African Republic, for example, civilians have begun to associate Wagner with the longest stretch of peace that their capital city has seen in decades. And in the Sahel, they've recently rebranded, becoming the so-called Africa Corps, a clear and overt nod to the Nazi Africa Corps who rolled across North Africa under the command of Erwin Rommel during World War II. Along with the new name comes a new pitch to the countries of the Sahel, support in finally throwing off the shackles of neocolonialism and cleansing themselves of Western influence. So in a grand view, the military force known as the Wagner Group has splintered, but it would be a mistake to assume they're gone completely. Instead, the organization has turned into a fungus, releasing its spores, allowing them to travel far and wide, and perhaps even take root independent from each other. With any luck, these splinter groups will not be able to have nearly the effect the original Wagner Group did, but just as likely is that a long-term chaos agent has been turned into a dozen chaos agents, and that's probably not good for anyone. And last of all today, we examine the world in review. 2023 has, in many ways, been a pivotal year for global affairs. New battlefronts have opened, existing ones have gotten bigger and more intractable. The effort to reach peace has been far less successful than the world might have hoped, and in far-flung corners of the globe, more and more crisis spots have shown the potential to expand into conflagration. Not to mention, this channel started doing the Situation Room. Perhaps most striking of all is the way that Russia's global influence has so starkly diminished in the last 12 months. We've already mentioned the fracturing of the Wagner Group and Russia's decreasing ability to maintain control of its paramilitaries in Africa. But the change runs far deeper than that. Also in Africa, dependency on Russian oil has backfired, fueling inflation and heightening the region's financial insecurity, while justifiably nations dependent on Russian and Ukrainian grain have not taken kindly to being used as pawns. In Southeast Asia, Russia has tied itself to military juntas that seem increasingly unstable, ensuring that populations who've endured massacre by Russian weapons will remember them coldly. But with Russia's clear inability to steamroll a much weaker neighbor military, the Russian threat of force is no longer enough to keep those same juntas in power. Russia's once formidable ability to stabilize the post-Soviet world seems to no longer exist, as evidenced by Azerbaijan's brazen conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh and by efforts not just in Ukraine but neighboring Moldova to gain expedited admission into NATO and the European Union. Russia's purported superweapons have shown to lack teeth, from its Kinzhal missile to its fifth-generation Su-57, and even its ability to protect its own people has been called into question with drone attacks in Moscow, suspected sabotage incidents across Russia, and a full Wagner mutiny, all revealing the fragility of the Russian government. And although Western nations, particularly the United States, continue to hold deep-seated suspicion over China's push for hegemony, that effort too has stalled in the face of growing global opposition. Once hailed as the cornerstone of China's plan to be the next great global power, the Belt and Road Initiative has stalled out badly around the world, with nations from Europe to Africa to East Asia proving either disillusioned with China's economic pitch or badly disappointed with China's ability, or lack thereof, to deliver on their promises. In the waters off the Chinese coast, regional naval powers have increasingly begun to align against Xi Jinping's military, and new trilateral partnerships between Japan, South Korea, and the US on all manner of military and economic issues suggest that Western influence on China's doorstep is growing more powerful, not less so. The Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and other potential allies have instead grown more fearful of Chinese influence and are increasingly turning toward the Americans as an alternative. That certainly doesn't mean that China has stopped being a factor. It is the top global trading partner of well over 100 countries, and it's grown increasingly hostile in the South China Sea. But at the very least, 2023 has made clear that China's Plan A is faltering. Soon, it'll be time to pursue a Plan B. The United States, too, has seen its global position change significantly in the last several months, especially as it increasingly finds itself on an island in support of Israel's counteroffensive in Gaza. What was, for a while, seen in most of the world as a retaliation against a massive terror attack has claimed more and more civilian lives with no real plan for de-escalation, and with the United States not backing down from its support of Israel, it's begun to alienate current and potential partners in the rest of the world. And the United States' extreme domestic polarization in the political sphere has begun to have more and more significant knock-on effects in foreign relations. Many nations around the world have had reason to fear that the strategic agreements they make with one American administration will not be honored by the next. While increasing efforts by Poland, South Korea, and other historic US partners to develop independent military capabilities have been taken positively by some portions of the American political sphere, they also represent a shifting global reality. The US is not as dependable as it once was, or as it claims to be. And if a nation wants to ensure that it can survive a war, it must accept that Uncle Sam might not be there to back it up. In Ukraine, the defining war of this decade so far has settled into a second bitter winter, with Russian and Ukrainian troops alike throwing themselves at a front line that seems to exist only to process and extinguish human life. For most of the year, both Russia and Ukraine have pushed back and forth for minuscule gain, walled off from forward progress by a seemingly endless belt of lethal landmines. On the Ukrainian side, Western support has begun to dwindle, while long-awaited tanks and fighter jets have yet to make it into active combat. On the Russian side, the latest American intelligence estimates suggest that over 300,000 troops have been killed or injured, a full 90% of the force that Russia was able to field before the start of the war. And although many of the casualties have been soldiers who entered but died on the front lines during the span of the war, it's still a staggering loss for a military that has long claimed to be the most powerful in the world. The same estimates suggest that losses to Russian equipment may have set back military modernization by 18 years, putting Russia at the same level of modernization it showed during the Second Chechen War. Now it appears the war may be close to a true stalemate, made worse by the arrival of winter, and if that stalemate really does set in, then it'll only be disrupted by either a major military advancement on either side or a peace that would strip Ukraine of much of its territory. Beyond the Russia-Ukrainian war and the Israel-Hamas war, many conflicts of the previous decade continue to stretch on. The Syrian civil war, now concluding its 12th year, has been frozen for many months, but is by no means over. In the country's northeastern reaches, Kurdish militias now have full control over their territory with the formal approval of the Syrian government. Anti-regime rebels do still exist in a state of open warfare. They hold the northwestern region of Idlib, but they're largely unable to strike outward or claim territory, while the Syrian army is free to mass on their doorstep in advance of a long-awaited final phase. Turkey, the US, and Israel are each militarily active on Syrian territory, and with the government and the remaining anti-Assad coalition unlikely to come to terms, it's almost certain that the war will either escalate again in 2024 or remain ongoing until 2025. In Yemen, over half a decade of brutal civil war has given way to one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, and a ceasefire negotiated by the UN and able to hold for most of the year has recently fallen apart. Inside Yemen, 13 million children are in need of humanitarian assistance, caught between a coalition-backed government that's been all too willing to accept high civilian casualties and the Houthi rebel organization, a group that has openly recruited thousands of child soldiers. Although just about every nation on Earth can agree that Yemen is in crisis, none have been eager to assume responsibility for addressing the situation there, and it's that hesitancy that has allowed the Houthi organization to begin launching missile and drone attacks against commercial ships in the Red Sea, with little to no fear of on-the-ground retaliation by the nations of the world. Nearby in Libya, the 2010 Syria war hasn't yet gone hot again, but with rival factions clashing more and more frequently in Libya's streets and well over 10,000 dead or missing after 2 immense dam collapses in September, fears are growing that that conflict too might reopen sooner rather than later. Across Africa, it seems that more nations are host to an active conflict zone than not. In addition to the conflicts that we've already mentioned in the Sahel, battles and skirmishes have raged across the Central African Republic, Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Sudan, by all accounts, is in the process of eating itself alive, while South Sudan, Somalia, and a handful of other nations seem to have already done that. Fears of a renewed conflict between Ethiopia, its neighbors, and its own people are reaching an all-time high, and Boko Haram and other armed organizations in northern Nigeria continue to wage a brutal war against the Nigerian state, to which Nigeria's own troops have responded with actions bordering on genocide. All this as Britain, France, and the European Union are attempting to pull up stakes. Russian grain and oil has conspicuously disappeared. The United States has proven unwilling to involve itself, and China's debt-trap diplomacy is looking like a more and more obvious bad idea for the countries of the region. In Asia, Iran and its network of proxy organizations continue to sow chaos, not just via Hamas in Israel and the Houthis in Yemen, but also with Hezbollah in Lebanon and a wide variety of military organizations in Iraq. Afghanistan continues to be a potential crisis spot, caught between two nations in Iran and Pakistan who've got very substantial militaries and very different opinions on the ruling Taliban. To the southeast, the security situation in Myanmar has rapidly deteriorated as an alliance of rebel factions are pushing hard to overthrow a military junta that's made a policy of conducting brutal air attacks against the civilian population. Meanwhile, Pakistan and the Philippines each wage their own counterinsurgencies against a range of factions, and India and China remain in a state of low-grade conflicts in the Himalayas, giving a decidedly sharp edge to the economic race between Asia's two rising major powers. In the grand strategic view, the world continues to engage in arms races in several areas simultaneously. Insofar as nuclear proliferation goes, both Russia and China have proven eager to adjust the current balance, with Russia attempting to disengage itself from the nuclear non-proliferation agreements that it's still a party to, and China looking to expand its nuclear arsenal to no less than 1,500 warheads in the next decade and a bit. Meanwhile, North Korea is eager to add to its own arsenal, and several nations from Saudi Arabia to Japan to South Korea to Iran possess breakout capabilities that could see them go nuclear very quickly. So too are hypersonic missile technology, missile defense systems, naval power projection tools like aircraft carriers, directed energy weapons, and even AI, all turning themselves into an arms race. Whichever nations can gain command of these emerging technologies first will be able to secure major advantages in the wars to come, while any nation that can rely on espionage, sabotage, or other covert means to keep each other away from the finish line will be heavily incentivized to do so. And finally, we've got to emphasize the changing focus of war itself, and specifically the growing and rapidly evolving list of things that nations are willing to go to war over. Perhaps most important are the technologies that power our digital world. Taiwan, for example, is responsible for construction of 92% of all advanced semiconductors, meaning that with mainland China keeping its sights trained on the country, the nations of the world are all the more incentivized to enter a conflict if it erupts. Rare earth elements are a similarly important potential flashpoint, as are materials like cobalt and copper. Those nations that control or influence production gain a massive advantage, while those that can be starved of such precious materials at a moment's notice are predictably eager to secure more control over their own production. As the climate continues to shift and global droughts become more extreme, 2024 will be yet another year in which the world edges closer and closer to water wars, a pattern that's already kicked off in 2023 in a brief, largely unnoticed clash between Iran and the Taliban and tensions over Egypt and Turkey's respective control over critical regional watersheds. As the targets of war continue to change, so too will global strategy in wartime need to evolve. After all, the wars of tomorrow will be fought over very different things than the wars of yesterday, but they'll be no less important and no less devastating. So, as we conclude the difficult, complex, and often violent year that was 2023 and roll into the yet uncharted waters of 2024, we do so with our focus clearly on the human cost of conflict. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed during the wars of 2023, troops and civilians alike, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, were wounded. Over 100 million people live displaced around the world, and hundreds of millions more live in places where active armed conflict is either ongoing or on the verge of kicking off. In the new year, we at Warographics will continue to provide updates, explain critical context, and do our very best to keep you informed on the many conflicts raging around the world, and the many others that will, no doubt, begin by the time we deliver our New Year's special next year. And that's us, signing off for 2023. Thanks for being here.